Boy gives his only jacket to a millionaire disguised as a desperate homeless man on a freezing night. The next morning, his act of kindness changes not just his life, but his entire community forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Mike Bennett's breath formed small clouds in the bitter Chicago air as he walked home from school. The wind whipped between the tall buildings, making the already frigid January temperature feel even colder. His worn blue jacket, the only one he owned, was zipped up to his chin, offering what little protection it could against the harsh winter evening. The streets of his neighborhood were quieter than usual, most people having sought shelter from the brutal cold snap that had gripped the city for the past week. Mike kept his hands buried deep in his pockets, trying to keep his fingers from going numb. The weight of his backpack felt heavier today after staying late to help clean the science lab. Any extra credit would help his grade, and he knew his mom worried enough about him without having to stress about his academics too. His mother's words from that morning echoed in his mind. "We're cutting it close this month, Mike," Linda Bennett had said over their meager breakfast, dark circles under her eyes, from working double shifts at the diner. "But we'll make it work, we always do." Mike knew she was worried, the heating bill was due, and winter had been particularly harsh this year. The local coffee shop's windows were steamed up from the warmth inside as he passed by. Mike caught his reflection, a tall, lanky 16-year-old with determined eyes and disheveled brown hair. His jacket, though clearly worn with frayed cuffs and a struggling zipper, was the best they could afford. It had been a Christmas gift from his mom 2 years ago, bought on layaway and paid off over 3 months. "Yo, Mike!" a familiar voice called out. He turned to see Chris Torres jogging toward him, bundled up in a thick winter coat. "Hey, man," Mike replied, managing a smile despite the cold. "Just getting home?" "Yeah, basketball practice ran late," Chris said, falling into step beside him. "You look frozen, bro. Why don't you come over for a bit? My mom made her famous hot chocolate." Mike shook his head, thinking about the pile of homework waiting for him. "Thanks, but I should get home. Mom's working late again and I need to get some studying done." Chris nodded, understanding in his eyes. They walked together for a few blocks, talking about their upcoming math test and the latest school drama, their conversation providing a brief distraction from the biting cold. At the corner of Madison Street, they parted ways, Chris heading toward the warmer part of town while Mike continued toward his neighborhood. The sun was setting earlier these days, casting long shadows across the snow-dusted sidewalks. As Mike passed the old movie theater that had closed down last summer, he saw him, an elderly man huddled in the doorway, shivering violently in clothes that were clearly inadequate for the weather. The man's face was partially hidden by a gray beard, but Mike could see his lips had taken on a bluish tinge. Mike slowed his pace, then stopped completely. Something about the way the man sat there, trying to make himself as small as possible against the cold, made Mike's chest tighten. He thought about his mom, about their bills, about how this jacket was supposed to last him through the winter. But as he looked at the shivering man again, he knew he couldn't just walk away. A few people hurried past, their eyes downcast, pretending not to notice the man in the doorway. Mike stood there for a moment longer, watching his own breath create clouds in the freezing air. The temperature was dropping by the minute, and the weather report had predicted it would hit below 0 tonight. His fingers found the zipper of his jacket, and before he could second-guess himself, he was already pulling it off. The bitter cold hit him immediately, cutting through his thin sweater like a knife. Mike took a few steps toward the doorway, his heart pounding not just from the cold, but from what he was about to do. His mom would probably be upset. This jacket was supposed to last him through the winter, and they couldn't afford another one. But looking at the man's trembling form, Mike knew this was the right thing to do, even if it meant he'd have to face the rest of winter without a coat. "Sir?" Mike's voice came out softer than he intended, barely audible above the howling wind. The elderly man slowly lifted his head, and their eyes met. The man's gaze was clear despite his apparent distress, and something about it caught Mike off guard. A spark of intelligence, perhaps, or a depth that seemed at odds with his current situation. "Here," Mike said, holding out his jacket with slightly trembling hands. Please take it. You need it more than I do." He tried to keep his voice steady, even as the cold air bit into his now exposed arms through his thin sweater. The man looked at the jacket, then back at Mike, his expression unreadable beneath his gray beard. "Son," he said, his voice surprisingly rich despite his apparent condition, "you'll freeze without it." Mike shook his head, pushing the jacket forward. "I'll be okay. I don't live far from here." It wasn't entirely true. He still had a good 20-minute walk ahead of him. But he couldn't bear the thought of walking away, leaving this man to face the bitter night alone. "You're sure?" the man asked, studying Mike's face intently. There was something peculiar about the way he spoke, about how he held himself despite his shivering, but Mike was too cold to dwell on it. "I'm sure," Mike insisted, draping the jacket over the man's shoulders. Just stay warm, okay?" The man slowly slipped his arms into the jacket, his movements deliberate. As he zipped it up, Mike noticed his hands. They were clean, his nails well-maintained, unlike what you might expect from someone living on the streets. But again, the bitter cold drove away any further contemplation. "Thank you," the man said softly, his eyes never leaving Mike's face. "What's your name, son?" "Mike Bennett," he answered, already backing away, his arms wrapped tightly around himself as the cold began to seep into his bones. "Mike Bennett," the man repeated, as if committing it to memory. "You're a rare kind of person, Mike Bennett." Mike managed a small smile before turning away, his teeth already starting to chatter. He could feel the man's eyes on his back as he walked away, and he quickened his pace, trying to generate some warmth through movement. The rest of the walk home was brutal. Without his jacket, the wind cut through his sweater like it wasn't even there. His fingers grew numb, then his face, and by the time he reached his apartment building, he could barely feel his feet. Mrs. Winters, their elderly neighbor, was just coming out to check her mail when Mike stumbled through the front door. "Michael Bennett," she exclaimed, taking in his jacketless state. "Where on earth is your coat? You'll catch your death out there." "I'm okay, Mrs. Winters," Mike managed through chattering teeth. "Just forgot it at school." The lie felt heavy on his tongue, but he didn't want to explain what he'd really done, not yet. She clucked her tongue disapprovingly, but reached out to pat his shoulder. "Get upstairs and warm up, young man. Your mother would have a fit if she saw you like this." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Mike nodded and headed up the 3 flights of stairs to their apartment, his frozen fingers fumbling with the key before he finally got the door open. The apartment wasn't much warmer than outside. They kept the heat low to save on bills, but at least there was no wind. He dropped his backpack by the door and went straight to his room, pulling on every layer he owned. 2 sweaters, a hoodie, and his warmest pair of sweatpants. Still shivering, he wrapped himself in his bed comforter and sat at his desk, trying to focus on his homework. The clock ticked slowly toward 7, and Mike kept glancing at it, knowing his mom would be home soon. He dreaded having to explain what happened to his jacket, but he couldn't bring himself to regret his decision. The image of the old man's blue-tinged lips and violent shivering wouldn't leave his mind. Finally, he heard the key in the lock, followed by his mother's tired footsteps. "Mike?" She called out, "You home?" "In here, Mom," he answered, his stomach tightening with anticipation. Linda Bennett appeared in his doorway, still in her diner uniform, her face lined with exhaustion from another long shift. Her eyes immediately went to Mike's blanket-wrapped form, then scanned the room, clearly looking for his missing jacket. "Mike," she said slowly, her voice carrying that mix of concern and impending disappointment that only mothers can master. "Where's your jacket?" Mike swallowed hard, meeting his mother's tired eyes. "Mom, I had to give it away. There was this man, he was freezing, and I couldn't walk past him, I couldn't." Linda Bennett stood in the doorway, her expression shifting from concern to a complex mixture of pride and worry. She walked into Mike's room and sat down on his bed, patting the space next to her. Mike, still wrapped in his comforter, moved to sit beside her, "Tell me everything," she said softly, wrapping an arm around his shoulders. Mike could feel her hand trembling slightly, whether from exhaustion or emotion, he wasn't sure. "He was just sitting there, Mom, in that old doorway by the closed theater," Mike explained, his voice quiet. "His lips were blue and he was shaking so bad I couldn't just walk by." He paused, looking down at his hands. "I know we can't afford another jacket right now, and I'm sorry, but—" "Shh," Linda interrupted, pulling him closer. "You did the right thing, baby. I just wish—" She trailed off, and Mike knew she was thinking about their tight budget, about the heating bill that was already overdue, about all the other expenses they could barely manage. "I'll be okay, Mom," Mike assured her, trying to sound confident. "I can layer up and maybe I can pick up some extra hours at the grocery store on weekends." Linda shook her head, her eyes glistening. "You focus on school, Mike. I'll figure something out. I always do." She kissed his forehead and stood up, straightening her uniform. "Now let me heat up some soup. You're still shivering." As his mom headed to their small kitchen, Mike heard her muttering under her breath about checking the thrift stores on her next day off. His chest tightened with guilt, knowing he'd added another worry to her already heavy load. The evening passed quietly. They ate soup at their small kitchen table while Linda asked about his classes, carefully avoiding the topic of the jacket. After dinner, Mike tried to focus on his homework, but his mind kept drifting to the old man. Had he found somewhere warm to sleep? Was the jacket helping? Would he be okay? Around 9, there was a knock at their door. Linda answered it to find Mrs. Winters standing there with a thick cardigan. "I heard about what happened," she said, holding out the sweater. "It was my late husband's, but it's just collecting dust in my closet. Please take it." Mike started to protest, but Mrs. Winters wouldn't hear it. "You're a good boy, Michael," she said firmly. "Let us help when we can." After she left, Mike held the cardigan in his hands. It was well worn but warm, smelling faintly of mothballs and old cologne. His throat felt tight as he slipped it on. He hadn't expected kindness to be returned so quickly. That night, Mike lay in bed under every blanket he owned, listening to the wind howl outside his window. His mom had finally gone to bed after spending an hour on the phone with various thrift stores, looking for an affordable replacement jacket. He could hear her tossing and turning in the next room, probably still worrying about how to make ends meet. Despite the cold and the guilt, Mike didn't regret his decision. The image of the old man's eyes stayed with him. There had been something about them, something he couldn't quite place. They hadn't looked defeated or desperate like you might expect. Instead, they had seemed observant, almost calculating. The next morning dawned gray and even colder than the day before. Mike layered Mr. Winter's cardigan over 2 sweaters and headed out early, wanting to check the doorway where he'd left the old man. But when he reached the spot, it was empty. There was no sign anyone had been there at all. "Looking for someone?" a voice called out. Mike turned to see Chris approaching, his breath visible in the frigid air. "Yeah, there was this old man here yesterday." Mike started to explain, but Chris cut him off. "The one you gave your jacket to?" "Word's getting around, man. Sophie Taylor was telling everyone about it in the first period. Said she saw the whole thing on her way home yesterday." Mike felt his face heat up despite the cold. Sophie Taylor was in his English class, always sitting 2 rows ahead of him. He'd had a crush on her since freshman year, though they'd barely spoken. "It wasn't a big deal," Mike mumbled, shoving his hands deep into his pockets. "Not a big deal?" Chris scoffed. "Bro, it was like -10 degrees last night, and you gave away your only jacket. That's pretty hardcore." As they walked to school together, Mike noticed more people than usual nodding hello to him. In the first period, Sophie turned around in her seat to give him a warm smile, and his heart did a little flip. Even Ms. Andrews, his English teacher, seemed to look at him differently when he walked into class. But it wasn't until lunch that things really started to change. Mike was sitting with Chris in the cafeteria when Dr. Harrison, the school principal, approached their table. "Mr. Bennett," he said, his voice carrying that formal tone he always used with students. Could you come with me for a moment? There's someone here who would like to speak with you. Mike exchanged a puzzled look with Chris before standing up to follow Dr. Harrison. His mind raced with possibilities. Was he in trouble? Has something happened to his mom? The principal led him through the quiet hallways to the main office, where a well-dressed man in an expensive suit stood waiting. "Michael Bennett?" the man asked, extending his hand. "I'm Thomas Wright. I represent Mr. Robert Maxwell of Maxwell Investments." Mike shook his hand hesitantly, noting the man's firm grip and pristine appearance. "Nice to meet you, but I don't understand why." "Please, sit down." Mr. Wright gestured to one of the chairs. Dr. Harrison nodded encouragingly before stepping out, closing the door behind him. "Michael," Mr. Wright began, his voice warm but professional. "What would you say if I told you the man you gave your jacket to last night wasn't actually homeless?" Mike's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" "Mr. Maxwell, my employer, has a unique way of finding people with genuine kindness in their hearts. Once a year, he disguises himself as a homeless person in different cities, placing himself in situations where people might help him or ignore him." Mike sat there, stunned, as the pieces started falling into place. The well-maintained hands, the articulate speech, that spark of intelligence in the man's eyes. "You mean that was—" Mike couldn't quite finish the sentence. Mr. Wright smiled. "That's exactly why you deserve it, Michael. You didn't help for any reward. You gave your only jacket to a stranger simply because they needed it more than you did. That kind of genuine kindness is rare." Just then, there was a knock at the door. Dr. Harrison poked his head in. "Sorry to interrupt, but Mrs. Bennett has arrived." Mike's mother hurried into the office, still wearing her diner uniform, worry etched on her face. "Mike? What's going on?" "The school called and—" She stopped short when she saw Mr. Wright and the shopping bag full of winter clothes. Mr. Wright stood, extending his hand to Linda. "Mrs. Bennett, please sit down. I have some news that I think will make your day considerably better." Over the next 20 minutes, Mr. Wright explained everything to Linda, whose expression shifted from confusion to disbelief to tearful gratitude. When he mentioned the college fund, she grabbed Mike's hand, squeezing it tightly. "But there's one more thing," Mr. Wright said, pulling out another document. "Mr. Maxwell was impressed not just by Michael's kindness, but by the clear values you've instilled in him, Mrs. Bennett. He wants to offer you a position managing one of our corporate restaurants. The salary is significantly better than your current job, and it comes with full benefits." Linda's free hand flew to her mouth, tears spilling down her cheeks. I don't know what to say," she whispered. "Say yes," Mike said softly, squeezing her hand. "Mom, you deserve this." The next few days passed in a blur of changes. Linda accepted the position at Maxwell's corporate restaurant, and within a week, she was training at their downtown location. The work was challenging but rewarding, and for the first time in years, Mike saw his mother come home with a smile instead of exhaustion etched on her face. At school, word had spread quickly about what had happened. The story had taken on almost mythical proportions. Some said Mr. Maxwell had been testing the whole city. Others claimed he was starting a nationwide movement. But what really changed was how people treated each other. "It's like your jacket started a chain reaction," Sophie Taylor told Mike during lunch one day, sliding into the seat next to him. Her presence still made his heart race, but he was getting better at maintaining his composure around her. "What do you mean?" he asked, trying not to focus on how close she was sitting. "Haven't you noticed? Yesterday, Jamie from my math class gave his lunch to a freshman who forgot his money. This morning I saw 3 different people holding doors open for others. It's like everyone's trying to be kinder." Mike had noticed the changes, but he hadn't connected them to his action with the jacket. The atmosphere in the school hallways felt different, warmer somehow, despite the continuing winter cold outside. But the biggest surprise came when Mr. Wright returned to the school a week later, this time with an even more ambitious proposal. He requested a meeting with Dr. Harrison, Mike, and several other students and teachers, including Ms. Andrews. Mr. Maxwell was inspired by what happened here, Mr. Wright explained to the gathered group in the school library. He wants to establish a community outreach program starting with this school. The idea is to create a center where students can both receive help and learn to help others. Ms. Andrews leaned forward, her eyes bright with interest. What kind of program did you have in mind? A combination of things, Mr. Wright replied, spreading out some documents on the table. Tutoring programs, meal assistance, winter clothing drives, job training, anything that could help students and their families. Mr. Maxwell will provide the initial funding, but he wants the students to help design and run the programs. Why students? Someone asked. Mr. Wright smiled, looking directly at Mike. Because Mr. Maxwell believes that young people often have the clearest view of what needs to be done. They just need the resources and support to make it happen. Over the next hour, ideas flew around the table. Sophie suggested a homework help program where older students could tutor younger ones. Chris proposed organizing donation drives for sports equipment so everyone could participate in school athletics. Even Dr. Harrison got excited, offering to open the school gym for evening community programs. Mike sat quietly for a while, taking it all in. He thought about how one small action, giving away his jacket, had somehow sparked all of this. Finally, he spoke up. What if we made it bigger than just our school? He suggested, his voice gaining confidence as he continued. There are other schools in the area, other communities that need help. What if we could connect them all? Mr. Wright's eyes lit up. That's exactly the kind of thinking Mr. Maxwell was hoping for. In fact, he pulled out another folder. He's already looking into properties in the area that could serve as a central hub for these programs. The meeting stretched on, plans growing bigger and more detailed with each passing minute. By the end, they had the outline of something that felt important, something that could really make a difference. As people started to leave, Sophie hung back waiting for Mike. That was really amazing, she said, as they walked out together. Your idea about connecting different communities? That could help so many people. Mike felt his face warm at her praise. I just thought about how one small thing can lead to something bigger, like ripples in a pond. She smiled, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. Speaking of which, a bunch of us are meeting this weekend to start planning the tutoring program. Would you want to help? Yeah, Mike said, trying to keep his voice casual while his heart did somersaults. Yeah, I'd like that. As they walked down the hallway together, Mike caught his reflection in a classroom window. He was wearing one of the new jackets Mr. Maxwell had given him, but somehow that didn't feel like the most important change. There was something different in his eyes now. A sense of purpose, maybe, or the realization that one person really could make a difference. The weekend arrived with a fresh blanket of snow covering Chicago. But this time, Mike wasn't worried about the cold. He made his way to the school, where a group of students had gathered to start planning the tutoring program. The normally quiet Saturday halls were alive with excited chatter and purposeful energy. Sophie was already there when Mike arrived, organizing papers at one of the library tables. She waved him over, her face lighting up. Mike, I was hoping you'd come early. We've got so many people interested in helping. Look at all these sign-up sheets. The table was covered with lists of names, both of students offering to tutor and those seeking help. Mike picked up one of the sheets, recognizing many of the names. This is amazing, he said, genuinely impressed. I didn't expect so many people to want to get involved. It's because of you, Sophie said softly, looking at him with those bright eyes that still made his stomach flip. Your story showed everyone that one person can make a real difference. Before Mike could respond, Chris burst into the library, followed by several other students. Guys, you're not going to believe who just showed up, he announced, slightly out of breath. Through the library doors walked Mr. Robert Maxwell himself, Accompanied by Mr. Wright, Mike recognized him immediately, despite the expensive suit that had replaced the tattered clothes he'd worn that cold night. The same intelligent eyes, now twinkling with warmth, found Mike's across the room. "Mr. Bennett," Maxwell said, walking over with an extended hand. "I've been looking forward to meeting you properly." Mike shook his hand, still somewhat amazed by how life could change so dramatically in such a short time. "Sir, I thank you for everything you've done." Maxwell shook his head, smiling. "No, thank you, Michael. Your simple act of kindness that night. It reminded me of something I'd forgotten in all my years of business. Sometimes the smallest gestures can create the biggest changes." He turned to address the whole group, which had grown as more students arrived. "I'm here today because I believe in what you're all trying to create. This isn't just about tutoring or winter clothes or helping with homework. It's about building a community that cares for each other." Maxwell pulled out a small remote and clicked it, lowering a projection screen. "I'd like to show you something," he said, as images appeared on the screen. They were architectural renderings of a building, modern, welcoming, with large windows and open spaces. "This," Maxwell explained, "is going to be the Maxwell Community Center. But I don't want it to be just another charitable project. I want it to be something different, something created by young people, for young people. Something that grows from the ground up, just like your tutoring program." The images showed study rooms, a cafeteria, recreation areas, and even a small theater. But what caught Mike's eye was a detail in one of the renderings. A wall covered in winter jackets, free for anyone who needed one. "The center will be open to everyone," Maxwell continued. "But I want you, all of you, to help run it. You know better than anyone what your community needs." Sophie's hand found Mike's under the table, squeezing it excitedly. He felt his face flush but didn't pull away. "There's more," Maxwell said, clicking to the next slide. "We're establishing a scholarship program for students who demonstrate exceptional community service. And I'm pleased to announce that our first recipient is right here in this room." Mike's heart stopped as all eyes turned to him. Maxwell smiled warmly. "Michael, your act of kindness wasn't just about giving away a jacket. It was about recognizing another person's need and putting it before your own comfort. That's the kind of leadership we need." The room burst into applause, and Mike felt overwhelmed by the moment. Sophie was beaming at him, still holding his hand under the table. Chris was grinning from ear to ear. Even Mr. Wright looked moved. "But," Maxwell raised his hand for quiet, "this isn't just about one person or one scholarship. This is about creating something lasting, something that can help change lives for years to come. And I believe you all have the power to make that happen." The weeks that followed were filled with a flurry of activity. Construction on the Maxwell Community Center began immediately, and every day after school, Mike and a growing group of student volunteers would stop by to watch the progress and help where they could. The old abandoned building near their school was being transformed before their eyes. One particularly cold afternoon, Mike stood with Sophie and Chris at the construction site, watching workers install the large windows that would soon flood the building with natural light. The three had become inseparable since the program began, working together to coordinate various aspects of the center's future operations. "Can you believe this is really happening?" Sophie asked, her cheeks pink from the cold, but her eyes bright with excitement. "In just a few months, this place will be full of people helping each other. And to think it all started because you couldn't walk past someone who was cold," Chris added, nudging Mike with his elbow. "You're like a superhero, but instead of a cape, you gave away a jacket." Mike laughed, shaking his head. "I'm no superhero, I just did what anyone would have done." "But that's just it," Sophie said thoughtfully. "Not everyone would have done it. That's why this is so special." Their conversation was interrupted by Mr. Wright, who approached with a stack of papers in his hands. "Good news," he announced. "The first shipment of computers for the study center just arrived, and the cafeteria equipment will be here next week. We're ahead of schedule. The temporary office they'd set up across the street had become their unofficial headquarters. Inside, the walls were covered with plans, schedules, and lists of volunteers. Students would drift in and out throughout the day, offering ideas or signing up for various programs. "Mike," Mr. Wright called as they headed inside, "Mr. Maxwell wanted me to show you something." He pulled out a blueprint and spread it across the table. "This is going to be called the Bennett Room." Mike stared at the plans for what looked like a warm, welcoming space filled with comfortable chairs and bookshelves. But what caught his eye was the wall of winter clothing: jackets, scarves, gloves, and boots, all free for anyone in need. "He wants it to be a reminder," Mr. Wright explained, "that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can spark the biggest changes." That evening, Mike walked home with Sophie, their breaths creating clouds in the cold air. But unlike that fateful night weeks ago, they were both warmly dressed in new winter coats. "My mom can't stop talking about the parent volunteer program," Sophie said as they walked. "She's already planning cooking classes for the community kitchen." Mike smiled, thinking about how the center was bringing people together in ways he never expected. His own mother had been promoted to regional manager of Maxwell's restaurant division, and she was helping design the center's meal assistance program. They reached Sophie's street, and she turned to face him, her expression serious. "You know I saw you that night," she said quietly. "When you gave away your jacket. I was across the street, waiting for my dad to pick me up." Mike felt his face warm despite the cold. "You never told me that." "I wanted to, but—" She paused, biting her lip. "I was amazed by what you did, but I was also ashamed because I had seen that man too, and I didn't do anything. I just waited in the warm cafe until my dad came." "Sophie." "No, let me finish," she said. "Watching you give away your only jacket, it changed something in me, made me want to be better, do more. I think it did that for a lot of people." Before Mike could respond, Sophie quickly leaned in and kissed his cheek. "See you tomorrow?" she asked, already backing away toward her house, her face flushed pink. "Yeah," Mike managed to say, his heart racing. "Tomorrow." He walked the rest of the way home in a daze, his hand occasionally touching his cheek where Sophie had kissed him. When he reached his apartment building, he found Mrs. Winters outside, struggling with some grocery bags. "Let me help you with those," he said, taking the heavy bags from her hands. "Such a good boy," she smiled. "You know, ever since that night with your jacket, this whole building feels different. People are talking to each other more, helping each other. Even old Mr. Peterson from the 4th floor has started bringing in people's mail when it's too cold outside." The Maxwell Community Center's opening day arrived on a bright spring morning. The transformation was remarkable. What had once been an abandoned building was now a beacon of hope in the community. Crowds gathered outside, waiting for the official ribbon-cutting ceremony. Mike stood near the podium with his mother, both dressed in their best clothes. Linda Bennett's eyes were misty as she looked at the building, then at her son. "I am so proud of you," she whispered, squeezing his hand. "Look at what you helped create." The front of the building featured floor-to-ceiling windows that sparkled in the morning sun. Above the entrance, large letters spelled out Maxwell Community Center, with a smaller inscription underneath, "Where small acts of kindness create big changes." Mr. Maxwell stepped up to the podium, his presence commanding attention from the gathered crowd. "3 months ago," he began, "I sat in the cold on these very streets, disguised as a homeless man. I've done this exercise in cities across the country, testing human kindness. But here in Chicago, something extraordinary happened." He gestured toward Mike. "A young man gave me his only jacket without hesitation, knowing he would face the bitter winter cold himself. That simple act of kindness sparked something remarkable, not just in me, but in this entire community." The crowd applauded, and Mike felt Sophie slip her hand into his. She had become a constant presence in his life, her determination and compassion matching his own as they worked to bring the center to life. But this center, Maxwell continued, isn't just about one act of kindness. It's about all of you. It's about the students who volunteered their time to create programs, the parents who offered their skills, the teachers who extended their days to help. It's about a community coming together to take care of its own. He turned to gesture at the building behind him. Inside these walls, you'll find tutoring programs, job training facilities, a community kitchen, computer labs, and yes, a wall of winter clothing free for anyone who needs it. But more importantly, you'll find hope. You'll find proof that one person can make a difference, and that together, we can create lasting change. The ribbon-cutting ceremony was followed by tours of the facility. Mike watched as people explored the spaces he had come to know so well during construction. Children ran excitedly through the game room, parents examined the class schedules posted on bulletin boards, and elderly residents rested in the comfortable chairs of the Bennett room. Pretty amazing, isn't it? Chris appeared beside Mike, grinning. And check this out. He pointed to a wall where photos were being hung, a timeline of the center's creation. The first photo showed the old abandoned building, and the last showed today's grand opening. But in the middle was a photo that made Mike's heart skip, a grainy image from a security camera, showing him giving his jacket to what appeared to be a homeless man. "Where did that come from?" Mike asked, surprised. "Mr. Maxwell had it all along," Chris explained. "He said it's important for people to see where it all started." Throughout the day, people kept approaching Mike to shake his hand or share their plans for using the center. Ms. Andrews was organizing a creative writing workshop. Dr. Harrison talked about expanding the school's after-school programs to connect with the center. Even Mrs. Winters had signed up to teach knitting classes. "You know what's really cool?" Sophie said as they watched a group of kids excitedly sign up for the tutoring program. "This isn't just going to help people today. This place is going to be here for years, helping generations of families." Late in the afternoon, as the crowds began to thin, Mr. Maxwell found Mike sitting in the Bennett room. The wall of winter clothing behind them was already missing a few jackets. People in need had been encouraged to take what they required. "How does it feel?" Maxwell asked, sitting down beside him. Mike looked around the room, at the warm lighting and comfortable furniture, at the inscription on the wall that read, "Kindness changes everything." "Honestly, it feels unreal," Mike admitted. "All of this from one jacket?" Maxwell smiled, his eyes twinkling with that same intelligence Mike had noticed on that cold night. "Sometimes the smallest spark can start the biggest fire, but it takes the right person at the right moment to make the right choice." As spring turned to summer, the Maxwell Community Center became the heart of the neighborhood. Every day brought new stories of lives being changed, connections being made, and hope being restored. Mike, who had initially felt overwhelmed by all the attention, found himself naturally settling into a leadership role among the student volunteers. One particularly memorable afternoon, Mike was helping in the computer lab when a young boy came in clutching a worn backpack. He looked around nervously until Mike approached him with a friendly smile. "Hey there," Mike said, kneeling down to meet the boy's eyes. "I'm Mike. What's your name?" "Sam," the boy replied quietly. "Sam Foster. My teacher said. She said I could get help with my homework here." Mike recognized the look in Sam's eyes, the same mixture of hope and uncertainty he'd once felt himself. "You came to the right place, Sam. Let's find you a tutor." As luck would have it, Sophie was available. Mike watched as she sat with Sam, patiently helping him with his math problems. The boy's face lit up when he finally understood a concept he'd been struggling with, and Mike felt that now familiar warmth in his chest. The satisfaction of seeing someone's life improve, even in a small way. Later that day, Mr. Wright stopped by with some exciting news. "The Maxwell Foundation is impressed with what's happening here," he announced during the volunteer meeting. "They want to use this center as a model for similar facilities in other cities. and the room erupted in excited chatter. Mike felt Sophie's hand slip into his under the table, a gesture that had become their own small tradition. "But there's more," Mr. Wright continued, smiling. "They want some of you to help launch these new centers, to share what you've learned, to tell your stories, to inspire other communities." Chris let out a whoop of excitement. "Road trip," he called out, making everyone laugh. After the meeting, Mike walked through the center, taking it all in. The tutoring rooms were full of students helping each other with homework. In the community kitchen, Linda was teaching a cooking class to a group of eager participants. The Bennett room was occupied by a mix of people, some reading, some chatting, some just enjoying the comfortable space. Near the entrance, Mike paused to watch a woman selecting a jacket from the free clothing wall. She had that same hesitant look he'd seen so many times, the struggle between need and pride. He approached her gently. "They're all free," he said softly. "No strings attached." The woman turned to him, her eyes glistening. "It's for my daughter," she explained. "She's growing so fast and I just can't." "I understand," Mike assured her. "Take whatever you need, that's what this place is for." As the woman selected a jacket that would fit her daughter, Mike thought about how much his life had changed since that cold winter night. His mother was thriving in her new position. Their financial worries had eased and he had found a purpose he never expected. But more than that, he had discovered something about himself, and about people in general. Kindness wasn't just about grand gestures or big donations. Sometimes it was as simple as giving someone what they needed in the moment, whether that was a jacket, a helping hand, or just a friendly smile. That evening, as Mike was getting ready to leave, Mr. Maxwell himself stopped by. He often visited the center, but usually without fanfare, preferring to observe quietly how things were running. "Walk with me, Michael," he said, gesturing toward the Bennett room. They sat in the comfortable chairs, looking at the wall of clothing that had become a symbol of the center's mission. "Do you know why I do my annual test?" Maxwell asked suddenly. "Why do I dress as a homeless person and sit in the cold?" Mike shook his head, realizing he'd never actually asked. "Years ago I was that person," Maxwell said quietly. "Not pretending, really homeless, really cold, really alone. Someone helped me, gave me a chance, showed me kindness when I needed it most. I never forgot that feeling." He turned to Mike, his eyes serious. "What you did that night, giving away your only jacket, it wasn't just about helping someone in need. It was about showing others that it's possible to be kind, even when it costs us something. That's the lesson I hope this place teaches, every single day." The summer passed quickly, filled with activity at the center and plans for the future. Mike, Sophie, and Chris found themselves at the heart of the expansion project, helping to design programs that could be implemented in other cities. Their success story had caught the attention of news outlets, and more people were becoming interested in replicating what they'd created. One morning, as Mike arrived at the center, he found Sam Foster waiting by the entrance, bouncing with excitement. The young boy had become a regular presence, not just for tutoring anymore, but as one of their youngest volunteers. "Mike, Mike!" Sam called out, waving a paper in the air. "Look, I got an A on my math test." Mike grinned, examining the test paper with its bright red A at the top. "That's amazing, Sam. All that hard work with Sophie really paid off, huh?" "Yeah. And guess what? I'm helping Tommy from my class now. He was struggling with fractions just like I was, so I showed him what Sophie taught me." Mike felt his chest swell with pride. This was exactly what they'd hoped for, creating a cycle of helping others, passing on kindness like a torch being carried forward. Inside the center, preparations were underway for a special ceremony. Mr. Maxwell had announced that he wanted to celebrate the 3-month anniversary of the center's opening with an important announcement. The main hall was filled with people, students, parents, teachers, and community members who had all become part of the center's extended family. Sophie found Mike near the podium, straightening chairs. "Can you believe it's only been 3 months?" she asked, helping him with the last row. "It feels like we've been doing this forever." "In a good way though, right?" Mike asked, pausing to look at her. She was wearing the same warm smile that had become so familiar to him over the past months. "In the best way," she replied, reaching for his hand. The ceremony began with Mr. Wright presenting some impressive statistics. Over 500 students had received tutoring help. The job training program had helped 50 people find employment, and the free clothing initiative had provided winter wear to more than 200 families. But it was the personal stories that really showed the center's impact. Mrs. Winters spoke about how the knitting circle she started had become a support group for elderly residents who had been feeling isolated. Chris shared stories about kids who had discovered their love for learning through the tutoring program. Linda Bennett talked about how the cooking classes had evolved into a food security initiative for local families. Finally, Mr. Maxwell took the podium. "When we opened this center," he began, "we hoped to create a place where kindness could multiply, where one good deed could inspire another. Thanks to all of you, especially our young leaders, we've created something even more remarkable, a blueprint for change." He gestured for Mike to join him at the podium. Mike felt Sophie squeeze his hand encouragingly before he walked up. Michael Bennett gave away his jacket on a cold winter night, never expecting anything in return. That single act of kindness set something extraordinary in motion. Today, I'm pleased to announce that the Maxwell Foundation is establishing the Bennett Initiative, a program that will help create community centers like this one in cities across the country. The room erupted in applause. Mike felt overwhelmed, but in a good way. He looked out at the familiar faces, his mother beaming with pride, Chris giving him a thumbs up, Sam bouncing excitedly in his chair, Sophie watching him with that special smile she seemed to reserve just for him. "But that's not all," Maxwell continued. "We want our young leaders to help guide this expansion. Michael, Sophie, Chris, and any other student volunteers who wish to participate will have the opportunity to travel to other cities, sharing their experiences and helping establish new centers." After the ceremony, as people mingled and celebrated, Mike found himself back in the Bennett room. He stood looking at the wall of winter clothing, remembering that cold night that had changed everything. A small plaque had been added beneath the clothing racks. It read, "Sometimes the warmest gift is the one that costs us something to give." 1 year after that fateful winter night, Mike stood outside the Chicago Maxwell Community Center, watching as snowflakes drifted down from a gray sky. The building looked different now, warmer, more lived in, its windows glowing with welcoming light. A steady stream of people moved in and out, each person carrying their own story of how this place had changed their life. "Penny for your thoughts?" Sophie's voice pulled him from his reflection. She stood beside him, her breath creating small clouds in the cold air. Unlike that night a year ago, they were both wearing warm winter jackets. "Just thinking about how much has changed," Mike replied, taking her hand. "Did you know that yesterday someone came in to donate 20 jackets to the clothing wall? She said she'd been helped by the center last winter and wanted to give back." Sophie smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. The ripple effect in action. They walked inside together, passing through the now familiar halls. The Bennett Initiative had exceeded everyone's expectations. 3 new centers had opened in different cities, with 5 more under construction. Mike, Sophie, and Chris had spent part of their summer traveling to help launch them, sharing their experiences and inspiring other communities to create their own stories of change. In the main hall, they found Mr. Maxwell talking with Linda Bennett, who had recently been promoted to National Director of Community Programs for the Maxwell Foundation. She caught sight of Mike and waved him over. "Perfect timing," Maxwell said as they approached. "We were just discussing the new scholarship program." The program had been Linda's idea, creating opportunities for students who showed exceptional commitment to community service. The first round of scholarships would be awarded next month, and the applications had poured in from all over the city. "Mom, you're going to be late for your meeting," Mike reminded her. Linda was flying to Boston the next day to oversee the opening of their newest center. "Always looking out for me," she smiled, pulling him into a quick hug before gathering her papers. "Just like you look out for everyone else." After she left, Maxwell turned to Mike and Sophie. "Walk with me?" he asked, leading them toward the Bennett room. The room was quiet at this hour, the comfortable chairs occupied by a few people reading or studying. The wall of winter clothing, constantly being emptied and refilled by the cycle of giving, stood as a reminder of how everything had started. 1 year ago, Maxwell said, his voice soft with reflection, I sat in the cold, testing human kindness. I'd done it many times before, but something was different that night. Something about your decision, Michael, about the way you gave without hesitation, without thinking of reward. It reminded me of what's truly important. He turned to face them both. This center, the others we're building, they're not just about helping people. They're about showing people how to help each other. Every person who walks through these doors learns that lesson, and they carry it with them. Just then they heard excited voices in the hallway. Sam Foster burst into the room, followed by a group of younger kids. At 12 years old now, Sam had become one of their most enthusiastic volunteers, running his own after-school reading program for elementary school students. Mike, Sophie, he called out. We just finished our book. Can we pick out the next one now? Sophie laughed. Give us 5 minutes, Sam. We'll meet you in the library. As the kids rushed off, Maxwell smiled. You see? The cycle continues. The kindness multiplies. Later that evening, as Mike locked up the center, he paused to look at his reflection in the window. He saw more than just his own face. He saw the warm lights of the building behind him, the programs they'd created, the lives they'd touched, the community they'd built, all from one simple choice on a cold winter night. Outside, the snow was falling harder now. Mike and Sophie walked home together, their footprints marking the fresh snow. They passed the spot where it had all started, the old theater doorway where Mike had given away his jacket. Someone had placed a small plaque there, too. On this spot, a single act of kindness changed our community forever. You know what I love most about all of this? Sophie said, as they stopped to look at the plaque. It's not just about what happened here. It's about what's happening now, every day, in ways we might never even know about. Mike nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. Every person who received help at the center went on to help others. Every story of kindness inspired more kindness. The ripples kept spreading, touching lives far beyond what they could see. As they continued their walk home through the gentle snowfall, Mike felt a deep sense of peace. He had learned that change doesn't always come from grand gestures or elaborate plans. Sometimes it comes from simple choices, from deciding to help when it would be easier not to, from giving when it costs us something, from believing that one small act of kindness really can change everything. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.